view of Europe still seems far from friendly.
The European Union is in many ways nastier than China, okay? And we've just started with them. Oh, they'll come down a lot. You will.
But it's not business as usual. Washington plans to hike tariffs on most EU goods to 20% come July. And despite EU efforts to strike a deal and avoid the rise,
the financial markets had barely opened when the news hit like a sledgehammer. Over $2 trillion in global value wiped out, vanished because of an economic chain reaction set in motion by Donald Trump's aggressive tariff strategy. European markets were the first to plunge, but the shockwaves didn't stop there. Wall Street staggered, Asia reeled. Within hours, economists were comparing it to a slow-motion global detonation, and inside Mar-a-Lago, Donald Trump was reportedly in full-blown meltdown mode. This wasn't just another headline, it was a catastrophe of his own making.
Plus export restrictions on some chemicals and scrap steel. Last week, the EU threatened around $100 billion worth of counter-tariffs on a raft of American products from Boeing aircraft to bourbon whiskey.
First of all, we stand together. I mean, we're 27 countries, and it's very important that we stand together because our market is bigger than the US market. We are many consumers here on this side.
What began as a tough guy trade strategy had spiraled into a full-scale economic crisis. Months earlier, Trump had slapped steep tariffs on a variety of European imports, boasting that it would protect American industries and bring Europe to heel. But instead of bending, the EU retaliated with tariffs of their own, targeting American tech, agriculture, and manufacturing with surgical precision. Markets panicked. Investment froze, and then, like a tide going out before a tsunami, the value began to drain. The tipping point came when Germany's economic index fell off a cliff, dragging France and Italy with it. Billions evaporated in hours. Pension funds, tech giants, blue-chip stocks, even traditionally safe assets started bleeding. CNBC anchors couldn't keep up with the numbers. Bloomberg analysts fell into stunned silence, and behind closed doors, U.S. officials scrambled to contain the fallout.
That's something the EU says most members in the EU say that they do not want. What they want, they didn't want any of this trade war with the U.S., so they'd rather go back to before Mr. Trump was elected and have normal relationships. But what the EU does not want is the kind of deal that the UK has got, which is basically that the US gets to keep the 10% baseline tariff, which is essentially the set of tariffs that Trump imposed on all countries, 10% on all goods imported into the US. That hasn't worked out. They have suggested zero tariffs, which means you don't impose tariff on my goods and I don't impose tariff on yours, and that's that. Let's play it that way. The US has not accepted that idea, it seems, as well.
But Trump wasn't apologizing. He was raging. According to insiders, the former president screamed at aides, threw papers off his desk, and blamed globalist bankers, traitor economists, and even unnamed members of his own party for undermining his genius. One source described the scene as beyond unhinged. Trump reportedly demanded that his team spin it fast, insisting the crash was temporary and the tariffs were a beautiful success. But the numbers told a different story. Meanwhile, Stephen Klein, a top EU commissioner, stepped in front of cameras and delivered a brutal assessment. This collapse, he said, is not an accident. It is the direct result of reckless US trade aggression. We warned them. They didn't listen. The words stung. But what followed hit even harder. The EU announced it would be severing several joint trade projects with the US, freezing negotiations and moving billions in contracts to China. Within minutes, markets reacted again, plunging further. What started as a $300 billion downturn ballooned into $2 trillion in global losses, with American companies absorbing nearly half. And Trump? He stormed online. In a furious barrage of Truth Social posts, he lashed out at Europe, calling EU leaders leeches, snakes, and enemies of America's greatness. He accused them of economic warfare and called for retaliatory sanctions so severe they'd beg for mercy. But there was no sign of mercy coming from Brussels. If anything, Europe seemed emboldened. Financial experts warned that the collapse was just the beginning. With investor confidence shattered and global alliances fraying, the ripple effect could last for years. Already, American farmers were reporting massive losses as exports were blocked or hit with retaliatory fees. Tech firms watched billions in valuation vanish overnight, and consumer prices were starting to spike in industries affected by the trade war. But Trump didn't flinch, not publicly. At a hastily arranged rally later that evening, he stood at the podium and declared, "We are fighting for America's future. If a few stocks drop, so be it. This is a war for independence." His supporters roared, but behind the scenes, panic was rising. Even some Republican allies were distancing themselves, calling for an immediate de-escalation. "This isn't a trade dispute anymore," one senator said. "It's an economic wildfire." Colbert, Kimmel, and every late-night host pounced. "He just cost the world $2 trillion and still thinks he deserves a medal," Colbert joked. "At this rate, we'll be trading cows for medicine by next week." But this wasn't just comedy fodder. It was a real crisis. And for a man obsessed with legacy, Trump now faced a brutal truth. He wasn't being remembered as a deal-maker. He was being blamed as the man whose economic ego triggered the most expensive trade backlash in modern history. Financial historians began drawing comparisons to Smoot-Hawley, the infamous 1930 Tariff Act that worsened the Great Depression. The parallels were chilling. A populist president, nationalist rhetoric, retaliatory tariffs, and global economic freefall. But unlike in the 1930s, today's collapse was happening at internet speed. Each tick of the market watched in real time, every crash broadcast live. And still, Trump doubled down. He went on live TV, unfiltered, declaring that the fake media was rooting for the markets to crash and that the deep state had sabotaged the economy to make him look bad. He even floated the idea of pulling out of the WTO entirely. Analysts on every major network stared in disbelief. What made the moment so surreal wasn't just the economic chaos. It was Trump's refusal to accept responsibility, even as millions watched their savings erode and global partnerships collapse. He had built his brand on winning, but now the scoreboard showed a stunning loss, one the world wouldn't soon forget. By midnight, the fallout had become the top story in every major publication. $2 trillion gone, read one headline. Trump's trade war backfires, said another. Experts warned of looming recessions, supply chain collapses, and a long road to recovery. It wasn't just a market crash anymore, it was a leadership crisis. And at the center of it all stood Donald Trump, still shouting, still spinning, still refusing to blink.